In the early years of the 20th century, South America breathed with difficulty, almost as if the entire continent carried an invisible weight on its chest. Nations were young, but their wounds were old. Across Argentina, Chile, Peru, Bolivia, and beyond, the same story repeated again and again. Land owned by a few, hunger carried by many, power held by those who never felt its consequences. The cities were alive with culture and hope, yet beneath the surface lay a deep tension, a sense that the world was unbalanced, waiting for someone, anyone, to insist that it could be different. Factories rose like iron skeletons, swallowing workers for long hours and releasing them with barely enough wages to survive. Rural families labored across endless fields, planting and harvesting crops they would never taste. Children grew up watching their parents shrink under the weight of systems designed to keep them in place. And in the political halls of many nations, foreign influence, particularly from the United States, cast long shadows over local decisions. Governments changed rapidly, often not by votes, but by coups. Soldiers patrolled the streets more frequently than teachers walked the schools. In the minds of many, the dream of equality felt distant, like a horizon they could see but never reach. This was the world into which Ernesto Guevara was born in 1928, in the quiet Argentine town of Rosario. His home was ordinary in many ways: siblings, books, laughter, but wrapped around it was a world struggling to find its moral center. If South America was a continent gasping for breath, Ernesto was a child who understood that feeling quite literally. From his earliest memories, Ernesto battled asthma. While other children ran freely through the fields, he often sat still, listening to his own lungs betray him. He would inhale deeply, fighting for air as every breath seemed to come with effort. Nights were the hardest. Attacks arrived without warning, forcing his parents to rush him outside into the cool night air, hoping the breeze would calm his heating chest. The boy's body was fragile, but his spirit refused to bend. Each time the tightness eased, he would sit upright again, eyes bright, studying the world around him as if trying to understand why some must suffer more than others. There was something unusual about the way Ernesto watched the world. Even as a child, he observed not just people's actions, but the reasons behind them. He saw how workers returning from the fields dragged their feet, and he noticed the sharp difference between the mansions on the hills and the tiny homes along the riverbank. He asked questions, too many, according to some adults. But his parents encouraged his curiosity. His mother, Celia, filled the house with books, poetry, philosophy, politics, stories of explorers and revolutionaries. She believed children grew not only from food and protection, but from ideas. His father, also named Ernesto, nurtured a sense of stubborn fearlessness, often saying, "My son is made of iron." He said it jokingly, but in time, the world would repeat those words with awe. When his breathing allowed it, young Ernesto played rugby, swam in the rivers, and climbed the hills around the town. But even during those moments of freedom, asthma lurked nearby, ready to steal his breath again. Each struggle carved a quiet determination inside him. He learned early that life did not always give you ease, but it always gave you a choice: surrender or push forward. And Ernesto chose, again and again, to push. Yet, the most defining moments of his early years were not the battles with his own lungs, but the images he collected from the world around him. On trips with his family, he saw the vast landscapes of Argentina, mountains older than civilizations, plains that stretched beyond imagination, and towns where people worked hard but gained little. As he grew older, he began to understand that his personal struggles were small compared to the struggles of millions. But rather than turning away, he leaned closer, listening, watching, absorbing. South America in this era was alive with questions. Questions about wealth, fairness, dignity, and the rights of ordinary people. Intellectuals debated in cafes, workers organized. Students marched through streets calling for democracy and justice. And through newspapers and conversations, young Ernesto learned of revolutions in Mexico, labor movements in Chile, and peasants resisting landlords in Peru. To him, these were not distant events. They were signals, like sparks traveling across a dark landscape, looking for someone to kindle them into flame. Even as a boy, Ernesto believed that ideas mattered. He believed that the world could be pushed, shaped, questioned. And perhaps because he had grown used to struggling for each breath, he never assumed life must stay the way it was. He understood, instinctively, that effort could change outcomes. A breath could return, a body could heal. And maybe, just maybe, a society could be changed by human hands too. But the most striking thing about him was not his illness or his curiosity, but his eyes. Everyone who met him remembered them. Sharp, thoughtful, constantly searching for meaning. When other children laughed, Ernesto often paused to observe the moment, as if trying to understand what happiness really meant. When adults spoke about politics, he absorbed every word. When he encountered poverty, he felt it like a bruise on his own skin. His eyes revealed a fire that seemed too large for such a small boy, a fire that whispered, "The world can be different, and someone must help make it so." As South America wrestled with its inequalities, something inside Ernesto was quietly forming. A question, a longing, a restless desire to challenge the way things were. He did not yet know his path. He did not yet dream of revolutions or guerrilla warfare or becoming a symbol across continents. But the seeds were there, almost invisible, waiting for time and experience to coax them into full flame. In these early years, the continent's struggles and the boy's struggles intertwined. South America gasped under political oppression. Ernesto gasped under the weight of his asthma. Both sought a breath of freedom. Both searched for a force that could break the cycle of suffering. And though no one could have predicted it then, the child fighting for air on a quiet Argentine night would one day become a man whose very name ignited debates, inspired movements, and stirred the hearts of people he would never meet. For now, though, he was just Ernesto, a boy with fragile lungs, a fierce mind, and eyes full of unanswered questions. A boy growing up in a world waiting for a voice of defiance. A world waiting for someone who believed that courage and compassion could reshape history. And slowly, breath by breath, that someone was taking shape. Ernesto Guevara's childhood unfolded like a long struggle between breath and imagination. From the moment he could walk, asthma clung to him like an invisible companion. Heavy, persistent, always waiting to strike. It arrived in the middle of the night, or during a game, or even as he sat quietly reading. Every attack reminded him that his own body could turn into an enemy. And yet, in the spaces between those moments of fear, something remarkable was taking shape. A child who looked at the world with unusual intensity, as though each experience carried a hidden message. The Guevara household was nothing like the stiff traditional homes common in Argentina at the time. It breathed with books, debates, and a gentle kind of rebelliousness. Ernesto's mother, Celia de la Serna, was a woman of sharp mind and strong convictions. She came from an aristocratic family, but rejected the social pretensions that often came with her background. Celia read voraciously, philosophy, poetry, politics, and she encouraged her children to do the same. She believed that a child should be exposed not just to fairy tales, but to the complexities of the real world. Her voice was calm but firm, a presence that could cut through even the chaos of Ernesto's asthma attacks. His father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, was different still. He was warm, humorous, and open-minded, a man who valued curiosity, more than obedience. Their home was always full of visitors: writers, thinkers, activists, friends from different regions of Argentina. Conversations flowed freely, spilling from one room to another like streams of ideas. In this environment, young Ernesto absorbed knowledge the way lungs absorb air, eagerly, urgently, as if it were necessary for survival. But it was the contrast that shaped him the most. As a child, he lived in a body that constantly betrayed him, but grew up in a home that encouraged boldness, independence, and intellectual courage. Asthma forced him to stop, to pause, to observe. His family pushed him to ask questions, to analyze, to imagine. And from that tension emerged a mind that refused to sleep. When an asthma attack came, Ernesto's entire world narrowed to a battle between his lungs and the air he struggled to draw in. His chest tightened, as if pressed by an invisible hand. His lips sometimes turned pale. His breathing became sharp, fast, almost desperate. His parents would rush to his side, his father rubbing his back, his mother whispering soothing words while preparing remedies or carrying him near an open window. They learned to recognize the earliest signs of an attack: a change in posture, a small frown on his face, a sudden quietness. But even after the worst episodes, Ernesto refused to let fear become a cage. As soon as he could breathe comfortably again, he would return to the world with renewed energy. He climbed trees, chased his siblings, and played rugby, an aggressive sport that seemed completely incompatible with his condition. His coaches often told him it was foolish, but Ernesto insisted. "If I must fight for my breath," he once said, "I might as well fight for it doing something I love." That stubbornness became one of his defining traits. Yet, his interests extended far beyond physical adventures. He spent hours reading in the family library, a room stacked high with books of every kind. Celia introduced him to Shakespeare, Darwin, Neruda, and political thinkers whose names most children his age had never heard. Ernesto devoured them all. Fiction stirred his imagination, while philosophy taught him to question everything, from justice to power to the meaning of suffering. At an age when most children were preoccupied with games, Ernesto was already contemplating the inequality he observed during family trips and the stories he heard from workers and travelers. Even his asthma, which should have been a limitation, became a strange kind of teacher. On nights when he couldn't sleep because of the tightness in his chest, he would lie awake thinking about life, about the people he had met, about what made some families struggle while others thrived. The fog of asthma forced him inward, but his mind used that stillness to push outward into the world. His parents' differences also shaped him. His father's openness nurtured his sense of adventure, encouraging him to meet strangers, ask bold questions, and explore without fear. His mother's intellect sharpened his thinking, teaching him to articulate his thoughts clearly, to defend his ideas, and to challenge assumptions, even those held by adults. It was not unusual for visitors to find Ernesto, still a child with tousled hair and bright eyes, engaged in deep conversation about literature or politics. Some found it amusing. Others found it unsettling. But no one forgot him. The household was far from perfect. The Guevaras faced financial difficulties, social criticism, and emotional tensions, but they remained united in one essential belief. Children should grow not into obedience, but into individuality. And Ernesto embraced that freedom fully. His siblings often joked that Ernesto was the most peculiar among them. When he wasn't reading, he was tinkering with contraptions, experimenting with homemade remedies, or sketching maps of imaginary journeys. He had a natural inclination toward adventure, the kind of adventure that wasn't just physical, but also intellectual. He wanted to understand how things worked, how people lived, and why the world seemed carved into lines of privilege and suffering. Sometimes, During particularly difficult asthma episodes, he felt as though he were trapped in a thick fog, one that blurred vision, dulled sound, and narrowed existence down to the simple desire to breathe. But when the fog lifted, he seemed to emerge sharper, clearer, and even more determined to live intensely. It was as if each struggle strengthened not his lungs, but his will. In many ways, Ernesto's childhood was a contradiction. Fragile yet fearless. Sickly yet adventurous. Restricted yet intellectually free. The very limitations of his body pushed him toward a life of the mind, and the freedom of his mind pushed him toward imagining a world where no one would be held down by force or circumstance. Those who knew him as a child sensed that he was different, not simply because of his illness, but because of the way he responded to it. Most children retreat from pain. Ernesto confronted it with curiosity. Most children avoid discussing ideas that challenge adults. Ernesto embraced those conversations, even when they made others uncomfortable. Most children accept the world as they find it. Ernesto, even in his earliest years, wondered how it might be remade. Looking back, it is easy to see how these childhood years laid the foundation for the man he would become. A doctor who wanted to heal more than bodies, a rebel who refused to accept injustice as inevitable, a thinker who lived not for comfort, but for conviction. But in those early days, he was simply a boy learning to breathe through the fog, one determined inhale at a time. A boy encouraged by a family who believed in the power of ideas. A boy whose imagination grew stronger every time his lungs grew weak. And while he did not yet know the direction his life would take, the seeds of independence, compassion, and defiance were already taking root. For a child fighting for every breath, the world might have seemed overwhelming. But Ernesto did not grow up afraid of suffocation. He grew up determined to make sure others could breathe freely. And in that quiet, unassuming childhood, the story of Che Guevara was already beginning. By the time Ernesto Guevara reached his early 20s, the restless curiosity that had defined his childhood had grown into something larger, more urgent. He had trained as a medical student, studied human anatomy, memorized treatments, and learned how to soothe the suffering of patients under his care. But the more he studied the body, the more he wondered about the forces that shaped human lives. Not just disease, but poverty. Not just illness, but injustice. Books had given him theories. Conversations with his family had given him ideas. But he knew there were truths he could only learn on the road. And so, in 1952, Ernesto and his friend Alberto Granado set off on what they called La Poderosa, a battered old Norton 500 motorcycle whose name, the Mighty One, was more hopeful than accurate. The machine sputtered, rattled, and protested at every mile. Yet for two young men searching for meaning, it was enough. The road stretched ahead like a promise, and South America rose before them, not as a collection of borders, but as a living, breathing continent filled with people whose stories had never been told. As they rode north from Argentina, wind crashed against their faces, blurring the world around them into streaks of color. At first, the journey felt like adventure. Open skies, distant landscapes, and the joyful rhythm of movement. Ernesto kept notes in his diary, describing the humor of breakdowns, the warmth of strangers, the exhilaration of speed. But soon, the tone of his writing changed. The deeper they traveled into the continent, the more they encountered a world very different from their own. One of their first eye-opening stops was in Chile, where they met miners laboring in the vast copper fields, their faces darkened by dust, their bodies bent from years of repetitive strain. These men worked endless hours for pitiful wages, descending into the earth each day with no guarantee they would return alive. When Ernesto spoke to them, he saw exhaustion etched into their expressions. exhaustion not just from work, but from a lifetime of being told their lives mattered less than the wealth they extracted. One miner told him, "We are buried before we die." Those words stayed with him. He watched workers live in makeshift homes made of tin and scrap wood, their families surviving on food barely sufficient for growing children. The mining companies controlled everything: housing, stores, wages, and any attempt by workers to demand fairness was crushed by force. Ernesto realized that medical knowledge could heal wounds, but could not change the systems that created them. In his diary, he wrote of the miners, "Their suffering is the silent foundation upon which the wealth of others is built." That sentence marked a turning point. Continuing north, they entered Peru. And there, in the highlands, Ernesto encountered something that pierced him even deeper: a leper colony tucked away from the rest of society, as though humanity had decided that these people were too shameful to be seen. The patients' faces showed evidence of their disease, but their eyes were gentle, filled with longing for normal human contact. Their hands were scarred, but their voices were soft. Ernesto and Alberto did something unusual. They refused to wear gloves. They shook hands with the patients, embraced them, played sports with them, listened to their stories. In a place where people were treated as invisible, the young doctor gave them dignity. One night, as the colony celebrated Ernesto's birthday, he swam across the river that divided the doctor's housing from the leper patients' homes. It was a symbolic gesture, a way of saying he no longer wished to stand on the side of privilege. He wanted to cross boundaries, to break the invisible lines that separated one human life from another. Those experiences carved themselves into his memory more deeply than any lesson from medical school. Illness was not the greatest tragedy he saw. It was abandonment. It was the refusal of society to care for those who needed it most. But the journey continued, and with each passing mile, the world he had once seen as distant became painfully, intimately real. In Colombia, he met families torn apart by political violence. In Venezuela, he saw children begging for scraps along prosperous coastal towns. And throughout every rural region they visited, he witnessed farmers pushed off the land their ancestors had cultivated for generations. These were people who rose before dawn, worked until sunset, and still lived in poverty. Wealthy landowners expanded their estates, while the poor watched their small plots disappear. Sometimes through legal trickery, sometimes through intimidation, sometimes through outright force. Ernesto listened to their stories with growing anger. These were not isolated tragedies. They were patterns, symptoms of a deeper sickness spreading across the continent. A sickness rooted in inequality, foreign interference, and systems designed to keep power in the hands of a few. With every injustice he witnessed, the tone of his diary shifted. The early entries were playful, full of youthful humor. But as the miles accumulated, his writing grew sharper, more introspective, more urgent. He wrote, "I am not the same person who left Argentina months ago. The divisions in this continent are not lines on a map. They are wounds in the flesh of its people." In the evenings, while Alberto repaired the motorcycle or chatted with locals, Ernesto would sit alone under the stars, writing by the flicker of candlelight. He wrote about the inequality he saw, the cruelty, the unnecessary suffering. But he also wrote about the kindness of those who had nothing yet shared everything. Poor families took them into their homes, offered them food, shelter, and warmth, even when they could barely provide for themselves. That generosity humbled him. It taught him that dignity did not come from wealth, but from humanity. The motorcycle eventually broke down beyond repair, forcing the two young men to continue on foot, by hitchhiking or by boat. But the mechanical failure did not slow their journey. If anything, it deepened it. Traveling without the motorcycle brought them closer to the people, forcing them to walk through the same dust, face the same sun, and experience the same struggles as those they met. By the time Ernesto reached Venezuela, the final major stop of his journey, something fundamental within him had changed. He no longer saw himself simply as a medical student or an adventurer seeking excitement. He felt a new identity forming beneath the surface, shaped by the voices of miners, farmers, and the sick. Shaped by the faces of children who deserved better, and the elderly who had been forgotten. He began to believe that healing people required more than medicine. It required justice. When the journey came to an end, Ernesto did not return home with the same easy spirit he had left with. The continent had imprinted itself upon him. It had whispered its suffering into his lungs, its hope into his heartbeat, its injustices into his consciousness. His diary, later published as the Motorcycle Diaries, reflected not just the travels of a young man, but the awakening of a rebel. The seeds planted during his childhood, curiosity, compassion, defiance, had now sprouted into something stronger. He felt a fire rising within him, one fueled by the belief that no one should live in misery simply because of where they were born. He did not yet know where this fire would lead him. He did not yet know he would become a revolutionary, a soldier, a symbol. But the road had done its work. It had opened his eyes, sharpened his convictions, and connected him to the people he felt compelled to defend. As he prepared to step into the next chapter of his life, he carried with him not just memories, but a mission, a quiet determination that the world could and must be transformed. And on that long, winding journey through South America, the young man named Ernesto Guevara began the slow, irreversible transformation into the figure the world would one day call Che. By the time Ernesto Guevara completed his medical studies, he had already seen more of human suffering than many doctors encounter in a lifetime. He had touched the hands of leprosy patients abandoned by society, listened to the exhausted breath of miners who knew their lives would end deep underground, and witnessed farmers pushed out of the lands that once sustained their families. His journey across South America had not only opened his eyes, it had reshaped the entire landscape of his mind. Returning to Buenos Aires to finish medical school felt almost surreal. The lecture halls, the laboratories, the polished floors, all seemed distant from the raw realities he carried in his notebook and his memory. Yet, he persisted. He wanted to understand the human body fully, to master the science of healing. He studied not just diseases, but the social conditions that made them flourish. His professors knew him as a brilliant, if unconventional student, always curious, always questioning, always pushing the conversation deeper than the curriculum required. When he finally graduated in 1953, becoming Dr. Ernesto Guevara, it should have been a moment of pure pride. His family celebrated. Friends congratulated him, but inside, Ernesto felt something unexpected. A quiet restlessness, almost a discomfort. His diploma represented years of effort, but it did not feel like an ending. If anything, it felt like a beginning, one that demanded he confront questions the medical textbooks could never answer. Because while medical school had taught him how to diagnose illnesses, it had not taught him how to heal a society. Che, he was already beginning to grow into that name, recognized something deeply unsettling. The majority of the suffering he had witnessed across South America could not be cured with medicine. Poverty was not a medical condition. Exploitation was not a virus. Injustice could not be cut out with a scalpel or soothed with antibiotics. These were systemic wounds, inflicted by unequal structures, maintained by entrenched power, and passed from one generation to the next like inherited scars. Medical school had shown him how fragile the human body was. The world had shown him how fragile human dignity could be. He began to look at the field of medicine differently. Doctors could treat symptoms, but who would treat the causes? Who would challenge the economic and political mechanisms that condemned entire communities to a lifetime of hardship? Who would stand between the oppressed and the systems that slowly drained the life from them? These questions grew louder in his mind. In the calm of his small apartment, surrounded by piles of books and maps, Che often found himself gazing out the window, remembering the faces he had seen, the miner in Chile whose eyes were clouded with resignation, the Peruvian farmer holding on to the last piece of land his family had not yet lost, the Colombian mother whose child was weakened not by disease, but by hunger. Their stories replayed in his mind like scenes from a documentary he could not turn off. He thought of the leprosy colonies again, how the patients were isolated not only by illness, but by social abandonment. He remembered how their spirits lifted when someone simply shook their hand. That gesture, more than any treatment, had been healing. It taught him that the deeper wounds were always emotional, psychological, societal. Slowly, a realization crystallized. A doctor could heal one person at a time, but a revolutionary could heal millions. This belief did not emerge from arrogance. It emerged from empathy, from witnessing suffering so widespread that treating it one patient at a time felt like trying to stop a flood with a single sandbag. Che wanted to do more than alleviate pain. He wanted to eliminate the conditions that produced it. His medical degree became a symbol of potential, not accomplishment. During these months, Che immersed himself in political theory with the same intensity he once devoted to anatomy. He studied Marx, Engels, and Lenin, writers who examined the structures of society with the precision of surgeons. He saw parallels between biological systems and social ones. Just as the body could be weakened by hidden infections, a society could be weakened by exploitation and inequality. And just as a physician must sometimes act decisively to save a life, a society might require drastic measures to save its people. But it was not ideology alone that shaped his thinking. It was memory. Deep, vivid memory. He remembered the young miner who said he was buried before death. He remembered the look of relief in the eyes of a leprosy patient when Che shook his hand. He remembered the children eating scraps in the streets of Caracas, while wealth glittered only a few blocks away. These memories were not abstract examples. They were witnesses, silent testimonies of a continent in pain. Che began to feel that his stethoscope, though useful, was no longer enough. He carried it with him, but he also carried a growing conviction that society itself needed an operation, one that required more than medicine. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that knowledge, by itself, did not disrupt power. Universities produced brilliant minds, but brilliance alone could not dismantle injustice. Doctors could diagnose the consequences of inequality, but they could not challenge the systems that caused it. Scholars could write about poverty, but their words rarely changed the lives of the poor. Che understood something that many never do. Information is not transformation. Simply knowing the truth was not enough to change it. As this awareness deepened, Che's sense of identity shifted. He was a doctor, but he was also a witness. He had seen the continent up close, walked through its suffering, shared its meals, listened to its stories. That intimacy made neutrality impossible. A witness has a choice: turn away or intervene. Che chose intervention. He traveled again, this time to Bolivia, Peru, and Central America, not to seek adventure, but to understand the political forces shaping the continent. He witnessed foreign corporations controlling natural resources, governments suppressing labor movements, and military forces breaking up protests with brutal efficiency. Everywhere he went, he saw what he would later call the open veins of Latin America, the extraction of wealth from the land and the people, flowing endlessly toward outside powers while locals remained impoverished. Each journey strengthened his conviction. Healing society required confronting the roots of its suffering. The birth of Che as a doctor was not a simple graduation. It was an awakening, a realization that medicine and revolution, healing and resistance, compassion and action were not opposites, but interconnected forces. He once wrote in his notes, "I will fight disease wherever I find it, but I will also fight the causes of disease. A revolution is not made by doctors, but it may need one." And so, the young doctor stood at a crossroads, holding two identities in his hands. In one, the healer who could soothe pain. In the other, the witness who could no longer ignore its origins. He understood now why the miners' coughs never healed, why poor farmers were always exhausted, why leprosy patients were abandoned. Their suffering was not individual, it was structural. And a structure could only be changed from its foundations. This realization was the quiet spark that would eventually ignite his revolutionary path. Che was no longer just Ernesto, the curious boy. He was becoming something else. Something shaped by compassion, sharpened by injustice, and guided by the belief that healing humanity required more than bandages. It required courage. When Ernesto Che Guevara arrived in Guatemala in late 1953, he carried with him more than a medical degree and a travel-worn notebook. He carried hope, raw, bright, and stubborn. Guatemala had elected Jacobo Arbenz, a reformist president determined to lift his nation out of poverty by redistributing unused land from powerful foreign companies to local farmers. To Che, this was more than politics. This was a test case for everything he believed. That a nation could rise when its people were empowered. That justice could be built without violence. That progress could come through democratic reform rather than bloodshed. For the first time, Che thought he might be witnessing a peaceful revolution. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine that change did not always require war. But Guatemala was not an isolated world. Just beyond its borders loomed a giant, the United States, whose government viewed Arbenz's reforms as a threat, not because they endangered democracy, but because they threatened corporate interests, especially those of the United Fruit Company, a U.S. agribusiness empire that owned vast plantations and controlled enormous political influence across Central America. Che arrived with the optimism of a young doctor who believed in treating the wounds of society. What he found was a harsh lesson, that even the most hopeful experiments could be crushed by powers far greater than the will of the people, the promise of reform. At first, Guatemala felt alive with possibility. In the markets, Che saw farmers speaking proudly about finally owning the land they tilled. In cafes, intellectuals debated economic reforms with the energy of people who believed the future belonged to them. The city pulsed with movement, painters, poets, students, workers, all imagining a country freed from centuries of exploitation. Che, always hungry for knowledge, absorbed everything. He saw doctors volunteering in rural villages where healthcare had never existed. He saw teachers bringing books to communities that had been forgotten. He saw a government that, however imperfect, tried to place dignity above profit. For a brief moment, Che believed Guatemala might prove to the world that justice could come through democratic means. He rented a small room in a modest boarding house, lived simply, studied economic reforms, and made friends with students and activists. He even considered staying long-term, offering his medical services to help support the government's social programs. In his diary, he wrote, "Here, perhaps a new world is being born." But the birth of something new often draws the attention of those invested in the old. Storm clouds on the horizon. Soon, the atmosphere in Guatemala City shifted. Whispers grew louder. Rumors spread through the streets. The CIA was planning something. The United States accused Arbenz of being a communist, an exaggeration at best, a falsehood at worst. But in the Cold War climate, such accusations were enough to justify intervention. Washington did not fear ideology. It feared losing control over resources. One morning, Che noticed unfamiliar airplanes circling above the city. Not commercial planes, bombers. Their engines rumbled across the sky like warnings. People looked up nervously, unsure whether to trust their own government's reassurances. Over the following days, anti-government militias, trained, armed, and financed by the CIA, began crossing into Guatemala. Terror spread through the countryside. Radio stations broadcast propaganda claiming Arbenz was about to turn the nation into a communist dictatorship. Newspapers ran stories written not by journalists, but by CIA operatives. Che watched all this unfold with growing disbelief. He had always understood injustice, but this was something deeper. A nation on the verge of transformation being strangled before it could breathe. The collapse of hope. The attack intensified. Bombs dropped on strategic positions. Sabotage operations targeted infrastructure. The U.S. Navy positioned ships near Guatemalan waters in a show of force. Although Arbenz's supporters outnumbered the rebels, fear began to spread. And fear, Che realized, could collapse even the strongest ideals. As the pressure mounted, Guatemala's military, afraid of facing the United States, began to abandon the president. One by one, commanders turned their backs. The hope that had once filled the city drained away like water through cracked stone. Then came the day Che would never forget. Arbenz resigned. Not because he wanted to, not because he had lost the people's support, but because he understood that resisting would plunge his nation into bloodshed. And he refused to sacrifice Guatemalan lives to satisfy foreign power struggles. When the announcement echoed through the streets, the silence that followed was suffocating. People cried openly. Some shouted in anger. Others simply stood still, unable to process the weight of the moment. Che, watching from a crowded plaza, felt something inside him shatter. This was not a failed experiment. This was a murder of possibility. The peaceful path he had hoped for collapsed under the boots of a foreign intervention that cared nothing for human dignity. In that moment, Che wrote a sentence that marked a turning point in his soul. A government chosen by its people has been destroyed by those who fear the people. It was a bitter lesson, one he would carry for the rest of his life. Radicalization, Chinas did not flee Guatemala immediately. He stayed long enough to help protect activists targeted by the new military regime. Friends were arrested, some disappeared. Others whispered plans to escape into Mexico or El Salvador. Che used his medical training to assist those injured during the chaos and helped hide individuals who feared execution. But he could no longer deny the truth that had become clear. Idealism without power is fragile. Justice without force is vulnerable. Democracy without protection is doomed. Guatemala taught him something he had never wanted to learn: that peaceful reforms could be undone in a single day by those who held real power, the power of money, the power of military intervention, the power of fear. This realization did not make Che despair. It radicalized him. The young doctor who once believed in gentle progress now understood that structural change would always meet resistance. That the oppressed could not rely on the goodwill of the powerful. That defending justice sometimes required more than words or reforms. When Che finally left Guatemala, he was not the same man who had arrived. He carried no souvenirs, no celebrations, no joy. He carried a truth forged in fire. If injustice could crush a peaceful revolution, then justice might require the strength to resist. A seed, hardened by fire. Years later, Che would write that Guatemala was his political birth, the moment when his ideals met the real world and were forced to evolve. He entered the country with the heart of a healer. He left with the heart of a revolutionary. The collapse of Guatemala was not just a national tragedy. It was the final spark that transformed Ernesto Guevara into the man history would remember. His compassion remained, but it gained an edge. His beliefs remained, but they intensified. His dreams remained, but they became tied to action. Guatemala did not teach Che to hate. It taught him that those who exploit others never yield willingly. And so, the fire inside him grew. Not wild, but focused. Not reckless, but determined. Not blind, but sharpened by the understanding that change demanded courage, not just to dream, but to resist. The doctor was still there. But now, a revolutionary had begun to take shape beside him. When Ernesto Che Guevara arrived in Mexico City in 1954, he was a man in transition, somewhere between doctor and revolutionary, between witness and actor. Guatemala had changed him forever. It had shown him how fragile justice could be when confronted with foreign power. Now, in Mexico, he wandered through crowded streets filled with music, food stalls, and the hum of possibility, searching for a new direction. At first, life in Mexico seemed quiet compared to the turbulence he had just experienced. Che worked at a hospital, treated allergy patients to earn money, and spent long evenings reading in cheap cafes. But the city had a secret pulse, one that beat beneath the surface in the conversations of exiles, dreamers, and dissidents from across Latin America. It was only a matter of time before Che drifted toward it. And then, one evening, in an apartment filled with cigarette smoke and murmurs of political discussion, Che met Fidel Castro. The encounter. Fidel entered the room like a gust of kinetic energy. Tall, broad-shouldered, charismatic, speaking with the rapid cadence of someone who believed deeply in every word he said. He was already well known among Cuban exiles, a young lawyer who had led an attack against a military barracks in Cuba, been imprisoned, released, and then forced into exile by the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Che watched him quietly at first. Unlike Fidel, he was not loud nor theatrical. He didn't dominate the room, but his eyes, sharp, alert, always observing, betrayed a deep, simmering fire. Someone introduced them with casual words that would change world history. Fidel, this is Ernesto, an Argentine doctor. Ernesto, this is Fidel, leader of the Cuban rebels. They shook hands. Fidel spoke first, asking Che about Guatemala, about Arbans, about imperialism. Che answered with the blunt honesty that was becoming his trademark. There was no rhetoric in his voice, only conviction. As the night stretched on, they talked for hours. About poverty, about land reform, about foreign domination, about the possibility of true independence for Latin American nations. They spoke of injustice not as theory, but as something they had both seen firsthand. Here was the unexpected bond. A lawyer from Cuba and a doctor from Argentina, two men with entirely different origins, yet carrying the same wound inside them. By the end of the night, Fidel invited Che to join his movement. Che responded simply, "Wherever we go, I will go." It was not impulsive. It was recognition. Two flames finally meeting. Two directions finally aligning. Training for revolution. If Che had imagined that revolutionary life would involve lofty speeches and ideological debates, Mexico quickly corrected him. Fidel's group, soon to be known as the 26th of July movement, began to train secretly for guerrilla warfare. Their goal was astonishingly ambitious: sail from Mexico to Cuba and overthrow Batista, a dictator backed by the United States, supported by a powerful military, and feared by his own people. The rebels trained in the countryside, sometimes in dusty fields, sometimes in abandoned warehouses. They practiced firing rifles, setting up ambushes, and moving silently through brush. Many were inexperienced. Students, workers, farmers, exiles with passion but little discipline. Che was different. Though he was not a soldier, he approached training with the seriousness of someone preparing for more than battle, someone preparing for a moral mission. He absorbed every lesson, every technique, and unlike some who complained about exhaustion or hunger, Che pushed through every hardship without a word. His asthma, that lifelong shadow, followed him even here. During training marches, he often fell behind, gasping for breath. Dust triggered attacks. Running with equipment tightened his chest. But Che refused to let the others slow down for him. He carried his packs without complaint, forced his body forward, and insisted he be treated like everyone else. If he could not breathe, he would find a way to fight anyway. It didn't take long before his comrades noticed. One rebel later said, "He had the worst health and the strongest will." Another said, "Che never asked for anything he was not prepared to endure himself." And Fidel, always perceptive, saw in Che a rare combination of intelligence, compassion, and unbreakable resolve. Two leaders, two styles. Their personalities could not have been more different. Fidel was loud, booming, theatrical, capable of delivering speeches that held hundreds in suspense. He talked with sweeping gestures, big ideas, and unyielding optimism. He saw victory not as possibility, but inevitability. Che was quiet, analytical, almost severe. He spoke in short, sharp sentences. He questioned assumptions, challenged logistics, pointed out weaknesses in plans. His idealism was fierce, but grounded in practical observation. Where Fidel inspired emotion, Che inspired discipline. Where Fidel rallied crowds, Che sharpened their purpose. Some joked that Fidel was the fire that ignited rebellion, while Che was the steel that kept it from collapsing. Despite their differences, the two men complemented each other perfectly. Fidel needed someone who could think strategically, act decisively, and commit fully. Che needed a cause worthy of his sacrifice, and Fidel offered him one, choosing Cuba's fate. Che was not Cuban. He had no family there, no personal grievance against Batista. And yet, when Fidel asked him to join the mission to liberate Cuba, Che accepted without hesitation. Why? Because Guatemala had taught him a truth he could not ignore. The struggle for justice was not confined by borders. In Latin America, suffering was shared across nations by miners in Chile, farmers in Peru, leprosy patients in Colombia, and families crushed by coups in Guatemala. Cuba was simply the next chapter of the same story. Che saw in the Cuban Revolution an opportunity to put his beliefs into action. This was not theory. This was not debate. This was the chance to stand against oppression with courage, not just words. But his commitment came with a price. He wrote to his family, telling them he might never return. He gave up his medical career, abandoned his comfortable future, and stepped willingly toward danger. He told Fidel, "I am not risking my life for a flag, but for the idea that humanity deserves dignity." From that moment forward, Che became more than a supporter. He became one of the revolution's core pillars. A bond forged in purpose. Over months of planning and training, Fidel and Che grew close. Not as friends in the ordinary sense, but as comrades. Men bound by a shared vision, strong enough to withstand fear, doubt, and even death. Fidel admired Che's discipline and hard truths. Che admired Fidel's courage and unwavering belief. One night, while the group gathered around a campfire after training, Fidel turned to his brother Raul and whispered, "This Argentine will be vital to our cause." Che, sitting nearby, stared silently into the flames. He did not seek recognition. He sought transformation, of Cuba, of Latin America, of the world. The two flames, one roaring, one steady, had found the same direction. Becoming Che slowly, the rebels began to see him not just as Ernesto, the doctor from Argentina, but as Che, a nickname that signaled familiarity, affection, and identity. Che became the group's medic, their mentor in discipline, their quiet example of endurance. But he also became something else, a man willing to give every ounce of himself to a cause larger than his own life. His transformation was nearly complete. All that remained was the test of fire, a journey across the sea to Cuba that would push every one of them to the edge of survival. But for now, in Mexico, under dim lamps and whispered plans, Che and Fidel prepared to rewrite history. When the small, overcrowded yacht Grandma finally touched the Cuban shore in December 1956, the revolution seemed destined to fail before it even began. The crossing had been a disaster: seasickness, storms, exhaustion. And once the rebels landed, Batista's troops were waiting. Many were killed, others scattered. Only a handful survived long enough to flee into the wilderness. Among that battered, hungry group coughing from asthma and carrying far too much weight on his back was Che Guevara. Ahead of them towered the Sierra Maestra, a rugged mountain range that would become their home, their battlefield, and their crucible. No classroom, no book, no political theory could have prepared Che for what he was about to endure. The Sierra was where he would be transformed, from an idealist with a rifle into a hardened guerrilla commander. Yet, even in the darkest moments, the healer inside him refused to die. The mountains of hunger and hardship. Life in the Sierra Maestra began with a brutal simplicity: survive. Food was scarce. Dry clothes were a luxury. Rain soaked the rebels for days at a time, numbing their fingers, chilling their bones. At night, they slept on muddy ground, wrapped in tattered blankets, listening to Batista's planes groaning above them. Supplies were minimal. Weapons were old. Most wore the same pair of boots until they fell apart entirely. For Che, the mountains posed a personal challenge. The thin air and constant humidity triggered his asthma relentlessly. There were nights when he gasped for breath, his lungs seizing violently as he pressed his inhaler to his lips. He never let the men see his fear. He simply waited for the attack to pass, then rose in the morning as though nothing had happened. But even in suffering, Che found purpose. He turned a small cave into a makeshift clinic, stocked with scraps of medicine, vials he rationed like gold, and bandages torn from old shirts. Whenever a rebel was wounded, Che worked tirelessly, stitching wounds under candlelight, cleaning infections with shaky hands, and whispering calm reassurance to young fighters terrified of dying far from home. Sometimes he had to choose who could be saved and who could not. Those decisions carved deep lines into his character, lines of sorrow and responsibility and resolve. The doctor and the soldier. Though he was the unit's doctor, Che was not content to remain behind the lines. He carried a rifle and marched with the others, even when walking triggered his asthma. When ambushes erupted, he positioned himself at the front, not because he sought glory, but because he refused to demand of others what he would not endure himself. His dual role confused many new recruits. Was he a medic or a commander? A healer or a fighter? Che answered simply, "I am whatever the revolution needs." His bravery was not loud, like Fidel's speeches, nor dramatic, like the tales sung by troubadours. It was quiet, steady, the kind that inspired without effort. When a rebel collapsed from hunger during a long march, Che was the first to carry his gear. When morale broke, Che offered discipline wrapped in compassion, a rare combination that made men follow him instinctively. Soon, Fidel recognized Che's leadership. He promoted him from doctor to comandante, one of the highest ranks in the guerrilla army. But even as Che embraced his new role, he never stopped treating the wounded. A commander he might have been, but a healer he always remained, learning the harsh logic of war. War is never kind to the soft-hearted, and Chi, despite his harsh exterior, carried a deep well of compassion inside him. He wept over the deaths of comrades. He sat beside dying soldiers, holding their hands, listening to their final words. He wrote letters to families whose sons would never return. Yet the Sierra also demanded something else from him: ruthlessness. Guerrilla warfare was unforgiving. Traitors endangered everyone. Spies slipped into the mountains disguised as farmers. Batista's forces used torture and fear to gather intelligence. Trust was both precious and dangerous. Che learned to navigate these realities carefully. He began to understand that compassion for the poor and oppressed did not mean gentleness toward those who perpetuated cruelty. The mountains taught him the hard truth Guatemala had hinted at. In a world built on violence, justice sometimes required force. These lessons were painful, but they forged the Che who would one day become both admired and feared. Among the poor, a lesson in humanity. Though the Sierra was filled with hardship, it also offered inspiration. Living among the mountains meant living among Cuba's rural poor, farmers who had long suffered under Batista's regime. Their homes were humble, their meals were simple, their clothes were worn thin, but their hearts were open. When the rebels knocked on their doors, the campesinos shared whatever they had: rice, beans, a place to sleep, even when it meant going hungry themselves. Che was deeply moved. He spent hours talking with villagers, listening to their stories, their struggles, their hopes. He treated their illnesses, taught them how to prevent infection, and helped deliver babies in dimly lit huts. It was in these encounters that Che's ideals hardened into something beyond theory. Here were people who asked for nothing except dignity, people who had been ignored by the government, by landowners, by the world, people who deserved justice more than anyone he had ever met. And so, Che made them a promise, never spoken aloud, but etched into his heart: I will not abandon you. The growing bond with the rebel army. As weeks turned into months, Che became a pillar of the guerrilla movement. He organized training. He disciplined recruits. He read poetry to the men at night to keep their spirits alive. He memorized terrain, planned ambushes, and learned to navigate the mountains like a native. His leadership was not based on rank, but on example. He ate the same food as his men, often nothing more than a handful of plantains. He slept on the same damp ground. He refused any privilege or comfort. When a soldier complained, Che responded not with anger, but with calm resolve. Suffering is temporary. The cause is permanent. Slowly, he became more than a commander. He became a symbol of endurance. The Forge of Fire history remembers the Sierra Maestra as the birthplace of the Cuban Revolution. But for Che Guevara, it was something more. The forge where his identity was refined through fire. The hardships burned away any remaining hesitation. The suffering burned away any illusions about the cost of change. The camaraderie burned away any doubt about the worthiness of their struggle. He walked into the mountains a doctor who believed in justice. He would emerge a revolutionary who believed in transformation. Yet, even as he hardened, the core of compassion within him remained untouched. He never lost his tenderness toward the poor, his respect for his comrades, or his belief that the struggle was not for power, but for dignity. The Sierra Maestra had shown him both the cruelty of war and the beauty of solidarity. It had tested his body, strained his lungs, and pushed him to the edge of endurance. But it had also revealed his purpose. Here, in these mist-covered mountains, Che became the version of himself that the world would one day recognize. The healer who fought, the fighter who healed, the commander whose humanity never fully surrendered to the violence around him. In the forge of the Sierra Maestra, Che Guevara was reborn. Dawn came slowly to Havana on January 1st, 1959, as though the city itself did not yet believe the night had finally ended. For years, the Cuban people had lived under the shadow of Batista's dictatorship. Fear, corruption, and violence woven into the fabric of daily life. But on that morning, everything changed. The dictator fled the country in the dead of night. The old order collapsed behind him like a crumbling fortress. And the road to the capital opened for the rebels who had fought among the mountains, starved in the jungle, and buried their comrades beneath the trees. Leading them, alongside Fidel Castro, was Che Guevara. He had survived ambushes, hunger, malaria, asthma attacks, and the loneliness of command. But now, as he marched toward the heart of Havana, Che felt the surreal weight of history settling on his shoulders. The long struggle was over. The revolution had won. The people poured into the streets, shouting, crying, cheering, filling balconies and rooftops with flags and flowers. They threw their hands toward the rebels like a greeting to the dawn itself. And Che, riding in a battered military jeep, did not see himself reflected in their admiration. He saw responsibility. He saw expectation. He saw the fragile outline of a future not yet shaped. The entrance into Havana. As Che's column approached Havana, music filled the air. Drums, congas, voices rising in celebration. Men who had fought with him in the Sierra Maestra smiled through tears. Others remained silent, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. The city was glowing. Life was erupting everywhere. Thousands pressed toward the jeep, wanting only to touch the men who had carried their hopes through the darkness. People shouted Che's name, held up children, lifted banners with his portrait, drawn from the few blurry photographs taken during the war. He had become a symbol before he even realized it. The lean, bearded doctor with the intense eyes. The comandante who read poetry at night. The man who gave his food to others. The revolutionary who looked like someone carved out of principle itself. As he entered Havana, Che felt the strange dissonance between who he was and who people now imagined him to be. But there was no time for reflection. Havana was celebrating, yes, but beneath the joy, a deeper question waited. What comes after victory? A country without a government named Batista had not left behind a functioning state. He left behind chaos. The police were divided, courthouses were abandoned, hospitals lacked supplies, schools had no funding. Rural families were penniless, landless, and exhausted. In the first hours after victory, the rebels faced a truth that many revolutions encounter too late. Winning is easier than governing. Che understood this immediately. While Fidel addressed the crowds from balconies, Che began working quietly behind the scenes. He inspected prisons to halt acts of revenge. He secured hospitals to ensure treatment for wounded civilians. He mediated disputes among rebel factions, trying to prevent the revolution from fracturing before it had even begun. He slept little. He ate less. The asthma attacks returned with full force, triggered by humidity, fatigue, and tension. But Che kept going. Responsibility felt heavier than any rifle he had carried. The birth of a symbol. In the weeks that followed, photographs of Che appeared everywhere, on newspapers, posters, street murals. His face became an emblem of the revolution's purity. Strong, youthful, uncompromising. For many, he represented the moral compass of the movement, but symbols come with shadows. People expected him to embody perfection, unyielding principle, flawless judgment, heroic certainty. They did not see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he carried, the private doubts he whispered only to his diary. Che never wanted to be idolized. He wanted the revolution to succeed, quietly, practically, ethically. But the world had already begun to make him into something else. Responsibilities and sacrifice. The new government assigned Che multiple roles: more than any one person should hold. He became head of the new military tribunal system. He oversaw agrarian reform. He supervised the training of the new armed forces. He worked to eradicate illiteracy. He negotiated international agreements. He helped stabilize the Cuban economy. Every sunrise brought new tasks. Every sunset brought new crises. Che spent long nights in government offices, studying economic models, drafting policies, and writing letters to Fidel. He believed deeply that the revolution must not betray its promise to the poor. He fought tirelessly against corruption, privilege, and inequality, often clashing with those who wanted a more moderate path. His strictness, once a source of admiration in the mountains, became controversial in Havana. He demanded discipline. He punished abuses. He insisted that moral commitment must guide the new society. To some, he was a hero. To others, he was harsh. To all, he was unmistakably Che. The private darkness. Behind the victory carries a kind of loneliness no battlefield ever produces. Che had survived ambushes without fear, but now he faced a quieter enemy: doubt. He questioned every decision he made. He replayed moments from the war, the comrades who died, the villagers caught in crossfire, the children who would never know their fathers. He wondered whether he could live up to the ideals he had fought for. He sensed the burden of becoming a symbol, an icon whose humanity would be forgotten. Sometimes, late at night, he returned to the same thought. The revolution was won, but the struggle had only just begun. He saw poverty in the slums of Havana. He saw hunger in the countryside. He saw corruption trying to creep back into the folds of the new society. The victory had opened the door, nothing more. Now came the difficult part: building a just world. And Che was determined not to fail. A new Cuba and a changing Che. The more responsibility he assumed, the more Che changed. He became more introspective, more disciplined, more severe, even toward himself. His asthma worsened. His family saw him less. His life became intertwined entirely with the revolution. Yet, beneath the hardened exterior, the same heart remained: the boy who had crossed South America on a motorcycle, the doctor who refused to wear gloves in the leper colony, the guerrilla who carried the wounded through the mountains, the idealist who believed that dignity belonged to every human being. Che was not consumed by power. He was consumed by purpose. Victory had not softened him, it had sharpened him. Havana at dawn. In those early months of revolutionary rule, Che would often rise before the sun. He walked the streets quietly, unnoticed by most people. He watched fishermen repairing their nets, bakers preparing dough, children preparing for school, children who now had a future their parents had never known. He studied the horizon where the first light emerged. He watched Havana breathing peacefully. He felt the weight of everything still left to do. On one of those mornings, as a pale gold dawn spilled over the rooftops, Che whispered to himself, "We have won the war. Now we must win the peace." It was not triumph. It was a vow. Because even in victory, Che understood that revolutions are not measured by the battles they win, but by the lives they change. And so, with Havana glowing in the early morning light, the comandante who had marched from the mountains stepped into a new chapter. One filled not with rifles and ambushes, but with responsibility, sacrifice, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. The revolution had crowned him a symbol. History would make him a legend. But in that quiet dawn, Che Guevara was simply a man facing the long road ahead. Victory had carried Che Guevara to Havana on a wave of hope, but power carried him into a different landscape, one more complex, more fragile, and more exhausting than any battlefield. In the mountains, the enemy had been visible, tangible, and immediate. Now, in government buildings with their polished floors and endless paperwork, the enemy was something less defined. Bureaucracy? scarcity, corruption, and the heavy weight of expectation. Che never sought power, yet power found him. First, he became president of the National Bank of Cuba. Then, Minister of Industries, one of the most demanding positions in the new government. He accepted these roles not because he desired authority, but because he believed deeply that the revolution required sacrifice, discipline, and unwavering moral commitment. If this was what Cuba needed, then it was what Che would become. But governing a nation was not the same as leading rebels through a forest. It was slower, more frustrating, and far more costly to the soul. The doctor in the ministry. Every morning, long before dawn touched Havana's rooftops, Che arrived at the Ministry of Industries. He walked down the hallways, wearing a simple uniform, sleeves rolled up, notebooks in hand. The secretaries and workers often found him already deep in calculations or drafting policy proposals. He approached government work with the same intensity he had brought to the mountains. He read economic texts late into the night. He studied models from Europe, Asia, and Latin America. He tried to merge theory with the lived reality of Cuba's people. But the reality was harsh. Factories were outdated. Machinery was broken. Infrastructure was weak. The country relied too heavily on sugar exports. The U.S. embargo tightened around the island like a fist. Che was a doctor by training, not an economist. Yet, now he was responsible for building an entire industrial future from almost nothing. He once wrote in frustration, "We are attempting to build a new society without the tools the old one used." Still, he pushed forward. He visited factories personally, inspecting equipment, speaking with workers, asking about their needs. He often worked longer hours than anyone else, sometimes until 3 or 4 in the morning. His asthma worsened, but he ignored it. His colleagues begged him to rest. He refused. He believed a leader should suffer no less than his people. Principle versus pragmatism, Che's ideals were uncompromising. He believed that a socialist society must be built on moral incentives, not financial ones. Workers should labor not for personal gain, but for the good of the collective. He envisioned factories driven by passion, purpose, and revolutionary spirit. But reality pushed back. Many workers still struggled with poverty. Families needed income. The transition away from capitalism created confusion and shortages. Some workers lacked motivation without tangible rewards. Che refused to lower his expectations. He urged Cubans to become what he called new men and women, people who embodied solidarity over self-interest. He believed deeply in this vision, almost spiritually. But his purity of purpose sometimes clashed with the practical needs of a struggling nation. Other ministers urged compromise. Che urged conviction. This tension created fractures within the government, not because he opposed others, but because he demanded more than most believed possible. He was trying to build a new society while living in the rubble of the old one. The weight of responsibility. Being head of the National Bank placed other heavy burdens on Che's shoulders. Through a mixture of improvisation, pressure, and urgency, he found himself managing Cuba's finances during a time of severe economic transformation. He signed banknotes with a simple "Che," rejecting the formality of traditional signatures. Some admired this simplicity. Others criticized it as reckless. But for Che, it was symbolic, a rejection of the old elite, and a claim that the revolution belonged to everyone, not to bureaucrats. Yet, in quiet moments, he confided to friends that he felt overwhelmed, not by the work itself, but by the distance between vision and reality. Factories broke down faster than he could repair them. International markets fluctuated unpredictably. The revolution demanded immediate results, but development required time. Time Cuba did not always have. Che sometimes stared at the maps covering his office walls, tracing supply routes with his finger. wondering how to breathe life into an economy that had been structured for foreign benefit rather than national strength. He felt caught in a storm of numbers, decisions, shortages, and expectations. In the mountains, he had known who he was. Here, he struggled to define himself. The human behind the icon. To the public, Che remained a symbol. Handsome, disciplined, eternally idealistic. His portrait hung in schools, offices, and factories. Workers cheered when he visited. Foreign journalists wrote admiring articles about him. But his personal life suffered. Exhaustion hollowed his eyes. Asthma kept him awake at night. He spent more time in meetings than with his children. He carried guilt for every shortage he could not solve. Those close to him described this period as the moment Cho stopped being simply a man and became a martyr of responsibility, someone who believed he had no right to rest while others struggled. Sometimes, in quiet conversations with friends, he wondered aloud whether he was failing the revolution. They reassured him, but Che was not easy on himself. He had an ideal in his mind, a vision so pure that no real-world society could ever match it. The builder of a new society. Despite the difficulties, Che accomplished more than many leaders do in a lifetime. He helped nationalize major industries. He created literacy programs. He pushed for rural electrification. He established industrial schools to train workers. He encouraged Cuba to diversify beyond sugar dependency. He oversaw trade agreements with countries across the globe. He worked tirelessly, believing that every hour, every decision, every sacrifice contributed to the birth of a more just world. Yet, as the months passed, a troubling realization seeped into his consciousness. Building a revolution required compromise, something his nature resisted. He fought against privilege, corruption, and inefficiency. He demanded honesty from everyone, including himself. He pushed Cuba toward an ideal that even he struggled to fully articulate. The conflict between what was and what should be wore him down like erosion shaping stone. A growing restlessness. Che began to feel out of place in government offices. His mind drifted back to the mountains, to the simplicity of struggle, to the clarity that comes from knowing exactly what must be done. He attended diplomatic receptions but felt uncomfortable in suits. He met foreign leaders but disliked political games. He wrote policy proposals but missed the directness of guerrilla life. Something inside him was shifting. He had fought his way into Havana to help build a new world. But now he wondered whether someone like him, even with all his discipline, intellect, and passion, belonged on the inside of government at all. Che was, at heart, a maker of revolutions, not a manager of institutions. The burden of power pressed heavily upon him, and with each passing day, he felt the whisper of a calling he could not ignore. A calling that came not from Havana's ministries, but from the struggles of people in other parts of the world. The builder, the minister, the believer. These roles had shaped him, but they could not contain him. Not for long. For years after the revolution, Che Guevara walked the corridors of Cuban government buildings with the same discipline he once carried through the forests of the Sierra Maestra. But even as he drafted industrial plans, negotiated trade agreements, and debated economic strategies, something inside him whispered restlessly. It was a quiet pulse, a distant call, a familiar fire that refused to be extinguished. Che was many things: doctor, economist, commander, philosopher, but he was not, and never could be, a bureaucrat. He tried. Truly he did. He wore suits when required, attended diplomatic receptions, and sat through long meetings about production quotas and sugar exports. He forced himself into the shape of a minister because the revolution needed one, but his spirit belonged elsewhere. His mind wandered not toward spreadsheets, but toward mountains. Not toward stability, but toward struggle. Not toward comfort, but toward causes. The man who had once marched barefoot through the jungle could not imagine a life seated behind a desk. The growing restlessness. The more he tried to adapt, the clearer the truth became. Che was not made for governing a country. He was made for transforming one. Power did not seduce him. Titles did not impress him. Diplomatic privileges did not tempt him. In fact, they troubled him. He refused higher salaries. He rejected luxury cars. He declined special treatment. He lived modestly, often too modestly for his health. His asthma worsened in Havana's humidity. Nights were long and sleepless. Yet even when his chest tightened painfully, he still worked until dawn, driven by a sense of duty that bordered on self-erasure. But duty alone could not silence the fire within him. He felt increasingly out of place in offices filled with paperwork, hierarchy, and cautious pragmatism. The revolution was no longer a guerrilla movement fueled by improvisation. It had become a state, with all the complexity and compromise that entailed. Che understood the necessity of this transformation, but he could not escape the feeling that his talents and his soul were being buried beneath the machinery of governance. He began to reflect more deeply on one question. Can a revolutionary remain whole when tied to the routine of power? Che's heart whispered its answer. No. The call beyond Cuba. As Cuba strengthened its alliances abroad, Che traveled to Africa and Asia, meeting leaders, activists, and ordinary people living under colonial rule or imperial domination. Their stories stirred something deep within him. He saw the same patterns of exploitation he had witnessed in South America during his youth. He recognized familiar wounds in unfamiliar lands. In the Congo, Angola, Mozambique, Vietnam, places far from Cuba, he found echoes of Guatemala, echoes of the miners in Chile, echoes of every poor farmer he'd ever met. Each echo deepened the fire inside him. Che began to believe that the Cuban Revolution was not an end, but a beginning. Not a home, but a launching point. Not a victory, but an invitation. He wanted to spread the revolution, to export it, as he said, not for glory, but for solidarity with all who suffered under oppression. He believed liberation was a universal right, not a national privilege, but he knew such beliefs came with consequences. A secret decision? Che understood that leaving Cuba would be controversial. He was beloved by the people, admired internationally, and respected by the revolutionaries who had fought beside him. His departure could weaken the government's image or cause confusion among the population. So, he made his decision quietly, privately, almost painfully. He wrote a letter to Fidel, one that history would later preserve, declaring his resignation from all government posts, giving up his Cuban citizenship, and relinquishing any claim to power or privilege. It was the opposite of what most men would do when standing at the height of influence. But Che was not most men. He had never been. In the letter, he wrote, "Other lands of the world demand the contribution of my modest efforts. I feel that I have fulfilled the part of my duty that bound me to the Cuban Revolution. I depart to fight, and fight with the purest faith." Fidel read the letter silently, knowing what it meant. It was not just the departure of a minister, it was the departure of a brother. Slipping away into the night. Che disappeared from public view. Rumors circulated, illness, death, secret missions, but no one knew the truth. He cut his hair, shaved his beard, changed his clothes, disguised his accent. The face that had become a symbol across the world now belonged to no country, no office, no home. He slipped out of Cuba quietly, almost invisibly, like a shadow leaving a room without disturbing the air. Those who saw him in those last days noticed something unusual. A serene determination, a profound stillness beneath the fire. He was not running away from Cuba. He was running towards something larger: the loneliness of purpose. Leaving Cuba meant leaving his family, his friends, his comrades, and the revolution he had helped build with sweat and blood. It meant embracing uncertainty, danger, and the possibility of death. It meant stepping once again into the wilderness, both literal and emotional. Che accepted this loneliness. Perhaps he even welcomed it. He believed revolutions were like seeds. They needed to be planted in many places to grow. He saw himself as a gardener wandering from land to land, offering what he could, fighting where he must, sacrificing when necessary. But this calling came at a personal cost. Nights alone in foreign safe houses, days spent training strangers, the ache of homesickness, the burden of secrecy, the weight of leaving behind those he loved, yet he never wavered. He had always despised complacency, hated stagnation, feared becoming ordinary. To Che, settling down was its own kind of death, the essence of Che. In the end, Che left Cuba not because he rejected it, but because he embodied it. Its idealism, its daring, its belief that justice must be pursued beyond borders. He was a man who refused to stand still, a man who believed revolutions must breathe, expand, and evolve. A man who saw the world not as a map of nations, but as a landscape of struggles waiting to be faced. Che's departure was not abandonment, it was continuity. It was the expression of his deepest truth. He was born to fight for the oppressed, wherever they were. And so, carrying nothing but conviction, he stepped back into the shadows of history, ready to ignite new fires in distant lands. It was a lonely decision, yes, but it was also the most honest expression of who he was. A man who refused to settle. A man who could not rest while injustice lived. A man whose heart beat in the rhythm of rebellion. When Che Guevara slipped out of Cuba and disappeared into the quiet corridors of secrecy, he carried with him the certainty that revolutions could be planted like seeds across the world. He believed that oppressed people everywhere, Latin America, Asia, Africa, shared the same hunger for dignity and liberation. And so, when he chose Congo as the next battlefield, he did so not impulsively, but with conviction. Congo was a land ripped open by colonialism, civil war, and foreign manipulation. Its forests were dense, its rivers wild, its politics fractured, its people exhausted by decades of exploitation. Che believed that if a revolutionary movement could survive in such a difficult place, then perhaps the spirit of liberation could spread across Africa like wildfire. But the Congo was not waiting for a savior, and it certainly was not waiting for a foreign comandantes. What Che found there would challenge not just his skills as a leader, but the very core of his beliefs. A battlefield of shadows. Che's arrival in the eastern Congo in 1965 was wrapped in layers of secrecy. He traveled under an alias. He disguised his appearance. Only a small circle of Cuban officials even knew where he had gone. Once in the Congo, he plunged into a landscape unlike anything he had experienced in Latin America. The country was a mosaic of armed factions, some ideological, some tribal, some motivated by survival more than purpose. Foreign mercenaries roamed freely. Neighboring nations interfered. The United States and Belgium supported forces opposing Che's allies. The jungle did not resemble the Sierra Maestra. It swallowed light, sound, order. It was not a refuge. It was a labyrinth. Che wrote, "This is not a battlefield. It is a confusion." The Congo tested him in ways he had never expected. A fractured resistance chiefs had come to support the followers of Patrice Lumumba, the assassinated Congolese leader whose vision for independence had inspired many across Africa. But the Lumumbist movement Che encountered was fractured by internal mistrust, weak leadership, and deep grievances. Che expected determination. He found hesitation. He sought unity. He found rivalry. He came to teach guerrilla tactics. He ended up navigating community disputes. Some local commanders resented Cuban influence. Others welcomed it, but lacked discipline. Many fighters were young, poorly trained, and rarely committed. Che tried to introduce structure, training sessions, drills, medical care, coordinated strategy. But discipline was difficult to impose on men who had grown up in constant chaos. Some arrived late to training, others disappeared for days. Many lacked weapons, ammunition, or even boots. Even communication was a struggle. Che spoke Spanish and French. Most Congolese fighters spoke Swahili or tribal languages. The gaps ran deeper than words. He once sighed in his diary, "I am fighting in a war where no one seems to want to fight." The weight of command. The Che who had guided columns through Cuba's mountains now faced a battlefield without clear lines, clear leadership, or clear direction. He found himself surrounded by forces he could not control. Political, cultural, military. The Congolese fighters admired him, but did not always understand him. His Cuban comrades respected him, but grew frustrated with their situation. Local leaders made promises they could not keep. Foreign enemies struck quickly and melted away. Che, who had always believed that willpower could overcome obstacles, was confronted for the first time with a truth he did not want to accept. A revolution cannot succeed if its people are not ready. He pushed himself relentlessly anyway. He treated the sick. He trained new recruits. He led patrols. He studied maps of terrain that shifted with every rainfall. He held long meetings with local commanders, trying to instill a vision of unity. But every accomplishment felt fragile, temporary, undermined by forces beyond his reach. Illness and disillusionment. The Congo did not spare Che's body. His asthma worsened in the thick humidity. He contracted dysentery. His weight dropped. He suffered repeated fevers. Yet he refused to be evacuated. He refused even to rest. Often he wrote by candlelight while his body shook from illness. He recorded not just events, but reflections. Deep, painful reflections about the limits of idealism. He had always believed that courage and conviction could transform history. In the Congo, he learned that history also resists. One night, after a failed operation against enemy forces, he wrote, "I came with dreams. Today, they feel like illusions washed away by the river." But even in disappointment, he did not grow bitter. His compassion for the Congolese people only deepened. He saw villages destroyed, children orphaned, families caught between warring factions. He saw hunger, disease, and despair woven into everyday life. He wanted desperately to help them, but he had to face another painful truth. Wanting to liberate a people is not the same as being able to. The hardest lesson. Che had always believed that revolutions were fueled by ideals: justice, equality, solidarity. But the Congo taught him another lesson. Ideals do not automatically become victories. Not every struggle is ready for revolution. Not every revolutionary is meant to lead everywhere. Not every battle can be won simply through willpower. This lesson humbled him in a way nothing else had. It stripped away layers of confidence. It sharpened his understanding of global conflict. It revealed the limits of even his own courage. Che began to realize that he could not transplant the Cuban experience onto other nations. Each land had its own history, its own wounds, its own trajectory. He wrote, "Revolution cannot be carried in a suitcase." A quiet withdrawal by late 1965, it became clear to Cuban leadership and to Che himself that the mission in the Congo was unsustainable. The rebels lacked unity, Foreign enemies held the advantage, and Che's health was deteriorating rapidly. Leaving was not failure in his eyes. It was necessity, but it felt like heartbreak. He withdrew in silence, disguised once again, while boarding a boat across Lake Tanganyika. As the shoreline of the Congo faded behind him, Che sat quietly, coughing from exhaustion, staring at a land whose pain he had touched but could not heal. He felt sorrow, not for himself, but for the Congolese people who would continue to suffer long after he departed. And yet, even in disappointment, a small ember remained inside him. He wrote in his diary, "The Congo defeated me, but it has not defeated the cause." Dreams that fell apart, but did not die. The Congo did not break Che, it refined him. It stripped him of illusions. It revealed his limits. It forced him to confront the difference between desire and destiny. It also reaffirmed something essential in him, his belief that struggle was necessary, even when victory was uncertain. Many would have returned home after such a setback. Many would have recalibrated expectations. Many would have accepted that their role in history had reached its end. But Che was not many. He remained the same relentless seeker who had left Argentina decades earlier, still searching for places where the oppressed cried out for help. The Congo had closed one door, but another waited far away in the mountains of South America. And Che, refusing to surrender to failure, would walk toward it. Bolivia was not a land of easy beginnings. It was a land of steep mountains, divided villages, wary glances, and deep political scars. Yet, when Che Guevara slipped into the country under a false identity in 1966, he carried with him something he had never been able to abandon: the belief that revolution could still ignite the heart of South America. He had left Cuba in secrecy, left the Congo in disappointment, and arrived in Bolivia carrying a single hope: that this landlocked nation might be the spark that set the entire continent aflame. In his mind, Bolivia was the crossroads of Latin America, a place where the oppressed majority might one day rise, shake off their chains, and reclaim their dignity. But reality, as always, was more complex than vision. Bolivia was the beginning of Che's last march, one shaped by isolation, betrayal, hunger, illness, and a strange, unwavering hope that refused to die. Dreams of a continental revolution. Che believed deeply that Latin America needed more than independent revolutions. It needed a unified movement, one capable of resisting foreign interference and overturning centuries of exploitation. Bolivia seemed geographically ideal. From its borders stretched paths into Chile, Peru, Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. If a revolutionary nucleus could survive here, he thought, it could grow into a force capable of transforming the entire continent. He traveled quietly into the Bolivian countryside, joined by a small group of Cuban comrades and a few local recruits. They established a guerrilla base along the Rio Nyancawazu, a dense area of jungle, riverbeds, and humid forests. The conditions were harsh but familiar. The isolation was suffocating but necessary. Che wrote in his notebook, "A new chapter begins. The soil is hard, but seeds grow in hard soil." He believed this with all his heart. He would hold on to that belief even as the world around him unraveled. A movement without allies. From the start, Che faced obstacles far greater than those in Cuba or even the Congo. Bolivia's political environment was fractured and suspicious. The Communist Party of Bolivia refused to support Che's efforts. Some feared foreign involvement, others doubted the feasibility of guerrilla warfare, and many simply distrusted his plan. Che had expected political divisions. He had not expected abandonment. Worse, the indigenous Quechua and Guarani communities in the region did not trust outsiders easily. Many did not speak Spanish. Some had been mistreated by the Bolivian military and by communists alike. Few saw any reason to risk their lives for a movement led by foreigners. The landscape itself felt distant, quiet, watchful, resisting intrusion. Day by day, Che sensed something he had not felt since the Congo. He was fighting alone, training a fragile army. Despite these challenges, Che began training his small band of fighters. Many were young Bolivians, idealistic but inexperienced. Others were Cubans who had followed him across the world, faithful to the man whose courage had shaped the Cuban Revolution. He taught them ambush tactics, survival strategies, medical skills, and political theory. He recited poetry during breaks. He cooked what little food they had. He treated blisters, infections, and insect bites. He spoke quietly about the dignity of the poor, the meaning of sacrifice, and the dream of a just world. But the difficulties mounted. Weapons were scarce, ammunition was limited, maps were unreliable. Supplies promised by allies never arrived. Still, the fighters admired Che's determination. Even when asthma attacks racked his chest, leaving him gasping on the forest floor, he refused rest. Even when his weight dropped dramatically, he continued leading marches through rugged terrain. Even when betrayal loomed in the air, he pressed on with the solemn discipline of a man who believed destiny was worth suffering for. The BT. Eventually, betrayal came, not in a single moment, but in a slow erosion of trust. Some local guerrillas deserted. Information leaked. Enemies gathered. Bolivian military forces, aided by U.S. advisors, and the CIA began closing in from all directions. The rebels found themselves surrounded by troops, helicopters, and air support far beyond anything they could match. Che wrote bitterly, "We are no longer invisible. The circle tightens." And tighten it did. Food became almost impossible to find. Streams dried up during drought. Diarrhea, fevers, dysentery, and infections tore through the camp. Che's asthma worsened to a frightening degree. He often walked bent over, clutching his inhaler like a lifeline, but the greatest wound was emotional. His belief in the Bolivian uprising was fading. The peasants did not join. The cities remained silent. The Communist Party withheld support. And every day, the jungle felt more like a trap. Yet, incredibly, Che continued writing in his diary, not as a man recording defeat, but as someone still searching for hope. He wrote of small victories, of the beauty of the landscape, of moments of camaraderie by the fire, of laughter between fighters, of the music they hummed to keep their spirits alive. Even in despair, he remained a believer. Hunger, illness, and courage. By mid-1967, the guerrilla group had split into two separate columns, both of them dangerously weakened. Che's column suffered the most. They endured hunger so severe that some fighters ate roots and leaves to survive. Their clothes tore apart. Their boots disintegrated. Mosquitoes swarmed relentlessly. Che's asthma attacks worsened drastically. Without enough medication, he sometimes collapsed during marches, gasping violently. His comrades wanted him to rest, but Che refused. He marched at the head or in the middle, never at the back. One fighter later recalled, "We wanted to carry him. He would not allow it. His pride was our burden and our inspiration." Che believed leadership meant suffering alongside those you hope to inspire. See Arudis Haklodis. As the months passed, Bolivian forces tightened their noose. Patrols multiplied. Ambushes grew more frequent. Escape became nearly impossible. Che sensed the end approaching. Yet his diary did not turn bitter or fearful. Instead, he wrote reflections, philosophical, tender, strangely calm. He wrote about the meaning of struggle. He wrote about his comrades' bravery. He wrote about Latin America and its future. He wrote about the need for persistence, even in the face of defeat. He wrote, "The example must live, even if the guerrilla does not." He knew he might not survive Bolivia, but he hoped the dream would. a quiet determination. What remains most haunting from this final chapter of Che's life is the contrast between physical collapse and spiritual resilience. He was ill, starving, exhausted. His beard was unkempt, his clothes were torn. His hair had grown long, his body had weakened, but his heart had not. He still believed a new world was possible. He still believed the poor deserved justice. He still believed that courage mattered more than victory. And in the jungle, between battles, he still found time to write poetry in his notebook. Even as the walls of the forest closed around him, Che Guevara remained, impossibly, hopeful. The last march, by October 1967, Che's column had been reduced to a handful of men. They retreated into the quebradas, narrow, steep ravines, where every sound echoed like a warning. Che walked slowly, his asthma worsening, his pack heavy, his rifle worn from use. But even then, he continued encouraging the men, reminding them why they had come, what they believed in, and what dignity meant in the face of overwhelming odds. His final diary entry read, "It is the end, but we will fight to the last." There was no fear in that sentence, only resolve, only the spirit of a man who refused to surrender, not to illness, not to hunger, not to betrayal, not to defeat. And thus, in the lonely ravines of Bolivia, Che marched for the last time. A man weakened in body, but unbroken in purpose, still carrying the same fire he had kindled in the mountains of Cuba, still dreaming of a world where justice grew like a seed in every corner of the earth. By October 1967, the Bolivian jungle had become a maze of danger tightening around Che Guevara like a noose. His small band of guerrillas, once hopeful, once determined, had been reduced to a handful of exhausted men. They were starving, ill, hunted. The enemy surrounded them from every direction, and the air itself seemed to whisper of endings. Che's body was failing. His asthma flared constantly. His strength faded day by day, but his spirit, fierce, disciplined, unyielding, remained as sharp as ever. The final march carried him into the quebradas of Quebrada del Uro, a ravine thick with brush and mud. It was supposed to be a temporary refuge. Instead, it became a trap. The ambush. On October 8, 1967, Bolivian Rangers, trained and supported by the CIA, moved quietly through the ravine. Che's group stumbled into them almost by accident. A gunfight erupted instantly. Bullets tore through foliage. Shouts ricocheted across the ravine walls. Explosions cracked through the humid air. Che tried to raise his rifle, but the weapon jammed. He threw himself behind a tree, clutching his asthma inhaler, coughing violently as his chest tightened. He reached for his sidearm, but a bullet shattered it. Another tore through his leg. With no weapon left, he had no choice but to surrender. When the soldiers approached, they found not a monster, not a mythical figure, but a tired man with tangled hair, mud on his boots, and fire still burning in his eyes. "Do not shoot," Che said calmly. "I am Che Guevara, and I am worth more to you alive than dead." Even in defeat, he spoke with dignity. They bound his hands and dragged him through the ravine, as if parading their victory before the jungle itself. Yet Che did not bow his head. He walked, limping, bloodied, coughing, but upright. He was no longer a threat, but he was still a symbol. And symbols frighten those who fear ideas. The schoolhouse at La Higuera Che was taken to a tiny schoolhouse in the remote village of La Higuera. The building was small, cold, and dimly lit. Nothing more than cracked walls, dusty floors, and the faint echo of children who were not there. It was in this lonely classroom that Che spent his final night alive. Villagers gathered quietly outside, murmuring prayers or watching silently. Many of them admired Che. They had heard how he treated the poor, how he shared his food, how he refused to harm civilians. To them, he was not a foreign invader, but a man who cared. Inside, Che sat on the dirt floor, wounded and exhausted. A Bolivian guard stood watch, For hours, the two spoke, not as enemies, but as men. Che asked about the soldier's family. The soldier later said, "He spoke to me with respect, even though I held the gun." Che refused food but accepted a pipe of tobacco. His breathing rattled, each inhale a battle. He knew his fate was sealed. But fear never entered his voice. The final conversation. The next morning, October 9th, orders arrived from Bolivian High Command. Orders influenced heavily by CIA operatives on the ground. Che was not to be tried. He was not to be interrogated further. He was not to be allowed to speak publicly. He was to be executed. The decision came not from courage, but from fear. Fear of the ideas he carried. Fear that a trial would make him a martyr. Fear that his words would ignite the world. A Bolivian sergeant named Mario Terán was chosen to carry out the execution. Terán hesitated. His hands shook. He remembered comrades killed by guerrillas. And yet, standing before Che, he saw not a monster, not even a fighter, but a man. Che looked directly into his eyes. Terán raised his rifle. His voice trembled. He could not do it. Che spoke softly. "Calm yourself. You are going to shoot a man." And then, with his final breath of defiance, "Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man. Póngase sereno y apunte bien. Va a matar a un hombre." He was not bragging. He was stating a truth. You can kill a man, but you cannot kill what he represents. The shots that tried to silence an idea. The shots rang out in bursts, not a clean execution, but a clumsy attempt to disguise it as a battlefield death. Bullets struck his legs, his chest. He collapsed onto the schoolhouse floor. A final shot pierced his heart. Silence followed. Deep, heavy, almost reverent. Che Guevara's body lay still, but something else was rising in the room. His story, his defiance, his refusal to beg, his dignity in the face of death. The soldiers felt it. The villagers felt it. The CIA agents felt it. Even those who hated him felt it. History, in that moment, was shifting. The body displayed to the world. After his execution, Che's body was flown to Vallegrande and placed on a concrete slab in the laundry room of a hospital. Photographers were brought in. Reporters were invited. Military officers hoped the images would prove the revolution had ended with the death of its most iconic face. The scene was surreal. Che lay with his eyes half open, a faint smile on his lips, looking strangely at peace. He resembled paintings of Christ taken down from the cross, an unintentional, haunting resemblance that would shape his legacy in ways no one expected. The world saw the photos, and instead of celebrating an enemy's death, millions felt something else, the birth of a legend. Che became more powerful in death than he had been in life. He became a symbol not of defeat, but of resistance. Not of failure, but of conviction. Not of violence, but of courage. The flame that would not die. Che Guevara died at 39 years old, but the flame he carried did not. In Latin America, his story spread like wildfire among the poor, the workers, the students, the dreamers. In Africa and Asia, he became a symbol of anti-colonial struggle. In Europe and North America, his image filled protests against war and injustice. His face, sharp, serious, unyielding, appeared on posters, walls, flags, shirts. A single photograph taken before his final march became one of the most reproduced images in the history of humanity. Ironically, the attempts to silence him amplified him. The shots that were meant to erase him immortalized him. Che Guevara, rebel, doctor, dreamer, soldier, became an idea. And ideas do not die. A flame cut short, but not extinguished. Che's execution was meant to close a chapter. Instead, it opened a new one. He became a symbol for those who believed the world could be more just, a reminder for those who refused to accept oppression as destiny. a cautionary tale for empires that believed guns could silence dreams. His enemies wanted to stop a revolution. Instead, they ignited something larger. Che's body was gone, but his flame, audacious, stubborn, burning, continued to move through history. Because in the end, the man who died in a quiet Bolivian schoolhouse was not just a soldier. He was a symbol of human courage in its purest form, the courage to believe in something so deeply that even death cannot defeat it. Che Guevara died in a small Bolivian schoolhouse in 1967, but the world did something unusual with his absence. It turned him into a presence, vast, bright, and impossible to ignore. In the years that followed, Che's face began to appear everywhere. On university walls, on underground newspapers, on banners raised during protests, on the jackets of revolutionaries and the notebooks of students, and eventually, on the simplest, most widespread canvas of all, the t-shirt. The image that spread across continents was not a photograph of the exhausted man captured in Bolivia, nor the wounded guerrilla with dirt on his clothes. It was a stylized portrait, sharp lines, high contrast, and unwavering eyes, created by Irish artist Jim Fitzpatrick, inspired by Alberto Corda's iconic photograph. It was the face of Che not as he died, but as he symbolized youth, rebellion, courage, defiance, purity of conviction. A myth had been born, and myths are powerful things. The birth of an icon. In Latin America, Che's image first appeared as a symbol of resistance, proof that the continent still carried a pulse, still had voices unwilling to surrender to dictators or foreign control. Students painted his face on walls beside slogans demanding justice. Workers carried his portrait during strikes. Guerrilla groups invoked his name as proof that courage could outlive bullets. In Africa, his image inspired movements fighting for independence. In Vietnam, he was admired as a brother in struggle. In Europe, he became a symbol of youth rejecting conformity. In the United States, he appeared on posters in dorm rooms, inspiring debates about war, empire, and moral responsibility. Che had become more than a man. He had become a symbol of refusal. Refusal to accept oppression, inequality, exploitation. But symbols do strange things. They simplify. They distort. They amplify. And slowly, Che transformed into something both larger and smaller than himself. From revolution to pop culture. By the 1970s and 1980s, Che's face began to appear in places no one could have predicted, not only in political rallies, but in fashion boutiques, music festivals, glossy magazines, and corporate advertisements. A face that once represented anti-capitalist struggle was now printed on items sold for profit. A man who rejected consumerism became one of its most marketable images. An icon of sacrifice became a brand. Che Guevara, rebel commander, doctor of the poor, revolutionary idealist, had become a global logo. Some celebrated the irony, others mourned it. Many never thought twice about it. What did it mean when a symbol of resistance became a commercial commodity? What did it mean when his image was worn not out of ideological belief, but because it looked cool? The myth of Che was spreading, but the man behind the myth was fading, blurred by trends, misunderstood by millions, and sometimes used by people who did not know or care about his ideas. It raised a question the world still struggles with. Are we honoring Che's legacy or diluting it? The power and the paradox. Che's image endured because it spoke to something universal. The desire for justice, the courage to resist, the dream of a better world. It captured the moment when a human being stands up and says, "No more." For many, that was enough. But Che's life was complex. His beliefs were intense. His actions were controversial. His commitment came with painful sacrifices and difficult decisions. The poster simplified all this into one expression: fiery eyes gazing toward a horizon of possibility. It was powerful. It was inspiring. But it was incomplete. Che Guevara was not an abstract idea. He was a man, one who struggled, studied, loved, fought, suffered, and believed with a depth that is difficult to capture in ink and canvas. The myth elevated him. The myth also obscured him. A symbol against oppression. Despite the simplification, Che's image carried real weight across the world. For millions living under authoritarian rule, his portrait became a secret sign of defiance. For laborers exploited by powerful systems, it represented their dignity. For students fighting for human rights, it embodied moral courage. Even people who disagreed with Che's methods could not ignore the emotional force of his icon. Because behind that image, behind the beret, the gaze, the sharp silhouette, was the essence of a human truth. That one voice can spark many. That one person can ignite a movement. That one life can echo long after it ends. The world used his image to say, "You cannot silence the idea of freedom. You cannot crush the spirit of rebellion. You cannot extinguish hope." And in that sense, the myth kept something alive that the Bolivian bullets could not kill. The commercialization problem. But as the decades passed, commercialization grew. Che appeared on mugs, posters, stickers, keychains, beach towels. Fashion brands used his image in runway shows. Tourist shops in Havana sold t-shirts bearing his face for foreign visitors. The contradiction became almost absurd. A Marxist revolutionary had become one of the most profitable faces in the world. Would Che have laughed? Would he have been horrified? Perhaps both. He had once written that revolutions were fueled by sacrifice, not spectacle. He believed deeply that ideas should remain pure, uncorrupted by personal gain or materialism. And yet, his image had become a commercial phenomenon precisely because it looked heroic, dramatic, stylish, like rebellion packaged for mass consumption. This tension leads us to the difficult question: are we celebrating Che's courage or reducing him to aesthetic rebellion? What do we really understand? In turning Che into a global icon, we took something from him and something from ourselves. We kept his fire, but forgot his context. We kept his face, but blurred his ideas. We kept his symbol, but lost some of his complexity. Understanding Che fully requires grappling with all sides of him: his idealism, his determination, his mistakes, his contradictions, his humanity. It requires acknowledging that he lived and died for a cause he believed in completely, even when the world misunderstood him. It requires asking whether we truly honor someone when we turn them into a symbol detached from their reality. And yet, there is a strange beauty in the persistence of his myth. The fact that Che's face still appears in protests against inequality, imperialism, and injustice shows that something of him remains powerful and relevant. Maybe the symbol survives because the struggle survives. Maybe the myth grows because oppression grows. Maybe the poster stays alive because the world still needs reminders of courage. The responsibility of remembering. The question is not whether Che's image should exist. The question is whether we understand what it asks of us. It is not a call to wear a t-shirt. It is a call to examine injustice. It is a call to ask ourselves what we truly believe in. It is a call to remember that ideals require sacrifice, sometimes the ultimate sacrifice. Che Guevara does not belong to commerce, or to governments, or to ideologies. He belongs to the ongoing human story of struggle and aspiration. His myth is powerful. His image is everywhere. But the meaning of that image is up to us. Do we see only a fashionable silhouette? Or do we see a human being who tried, imperfectly, intensely, to change the world? That, perhaps, is the real question his poster should raise. History often remembers Che Guevara as a face: sharp cheekbones, intense eyes, a beret tilted just so. But when we peel away the posters, the slogans, and the myths, what remains is something far more human, far more fragile, and far more meaningful. A man who believed deeply in something, and lived that belief with a courage that few ever attempt. This final reflection is not about glorifying Cha or condemning him. It is about understanding what his story reveals. About courage, about ideals, and about the complicated beauty of being human. Because Che Guevara's life was not a straight line. It was a storm. Brilliant, chaotic, unprincipled, flawed. A storm that lit the sky and scorched the earth below it. And from that storm, we learn: courage is not the absence of fear. Che faced fear constantly. As a child gasping for breath during an asthma attack. As a doctor holding the hands of the dying. As a guerrilla commander surrounded by enemy fire. As a prisoner awaiting execution in a Bolivian schoolhouse. But fear never dictated his actions. He felt it. He acknowledged it. And then he walked forward anyway. Courage, as Che showed, is not the calmness of the fearless. It is the determination of the fearful. It is the decision to act despite trembling hands. It is the choice to speak when silence feels safer. It is the willingness to continue even when the outcome is uncertain. Che's courage was quiet, stubborn, and deeply human. It came not from invincibility, but from conviction. If he teaches us anything, it is this: real courage is born in vulnerability. It is the bridge between fear and purpose. Ideals can light the world, but they can also burn. Che believed in justice with a fire that consumed him. He believed in dignity for the poor, liberation for the oppressed, and equality for all. These beliefs carried him across continents and into battles he could not win. But ideals, as powerful as they are also dangerous. They illuminate, they inspire, they uplift, and sometimes they scorch. Che's devotion was so intense that it often placed him at odds with the practical realities of the world. He demanded purity where compromise was sometimes necessary. He pushed himself beyond what his body could endure. He gave everything he had: health, comfort, relationships, time, his very life, to a dream that he believed transcended personal limits. His story reminds us that ideals are double-edged. They can guide us toward greatness. They can also isolate us. They can empower us. They can also destroy us. But without ideals, humanity drifts. Without vision, societies stagnate. Without dreamers, yes, even flawed ones, the world becomes a quieter, smaller place. And so, Che teaches us to hold our ideals close, but to hold them carefully, to let them inspire us without letting them consume us. Imperfection does not erase impact. Che Guevara was not perfect. He made mistakes. Strategic, political, moral. He made decisions that cost lives. He held convictions that many disagree with, even today. To remember Che honestly is to acknowledge all of him: the healer and the fighter, the idealist and the disciplinarian, the compassionate doctor and the uncompromising revolutionary. But it is equally important to see what his imperfections reveal: that ordinary humans, with all their flaws, can still shape history. Che was not a saint. He was not a myth. He was a man. Stubborn, passionate, brilliant, reckless, empathetic, relentless. And yet, because he believed so fiercely in justice, because he lived his ideals with such intensity, because he dared to imagine a world that did not yet exist, he left a mark on humanity that has not faded. His life is proof that history is not shaped solely by perfect people. It is shaped by those who care deeply enough to act. The legacy of a single life. When we strip away the slogans and the posters, what remains is a simple truth. One person can matter. Deeply, lastingly, unexpectedly. Che's writings are still studied, his ideas still debated, his image still carried into protests decades after his death. His story continues to provoke conversation about justice, oppression, and moral courage. People admire him, people criticize him, but very few remain indifferent to him. That is the true mark of a legacy. Not universal praise, but universal engagement. Che showed the world that conviction can echo across generations, that sacrifice can inspire, that courage can ripple far beyond the moment it is expressed. The Bedtime History Reflection. And so, as this story draws to a close, we return to the questions at its heart. What does Che teach us about courage? What does his story ask of us? What remains after the myth fades and only the human stands? The answers are gentle, simple, and profound. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to act even when you know the path will hurt. Ideals can light the world, but they can also burn the ones who carry them. And though Che Guevara was not perfect, he showed that a single life, lived with fierce belief, can leave footprints across history. His flame burned fast and fiercely, but it did not burn without purpose. It teaches us to examine what we truly believe in, to ask ourselves what kind of world we want to help build, to recognize that courage is not loud, not easy, not glamorous, but necessary. And in the quiet of night, as we reflect on the story of this complicated, determined, unforgettable man, we are left with a final truth. You may kill a person, but you cannot kill the power of conviction. You cannot silence the echo of courage. You cannot extinguish an idea whose time has come. Che's life was brief. His flaws were real. His hopes were immense. And his courage, the courage to believe, to act, to persist, remains a spark that still glows in the dark corners of the world. For in every struggle for dignity, in every voice that rises against oppression, in every dream of justice waiting to be born, a piece of his flame continues to burn.